there's no such thing as utopia, because what we see as very normal today, even in terms of technology, the device we're using and so forth, a few centuries ago, this was looked as impossible. So there's no limits into what human can create. The only limits are the limits of our imagination.
You're listening to the Futures Podcast, live from the Dubai Future Forum at the Museum of the Future, where you can not only witness the future, but you can shape it too. On this show, we meet the scientists, technologists, artists, and philosophers working together to dramatically alter what it means to be human. Some of their predictions will be preferable, others might seem impossible, but none of them are inevitable. My name is Luke Robert Mason, and I'm your host for this session. What can our dreams tell us about the future? Could dreaming, like foresight, be employed as a method for manifesting the world we want to live in? While our visions of the future are deeply personal, the impact of these imaginaries can be profoundly global. Joining me this morning is artist Pierre-Christophe Gam, who explores this concept by using identity and history as the foundational elements for crafting the future. Pierre, thank you for being here. Thank you for being with me at the Futures Podcast at the Dubai Future Forum. I guess my first question is your work. It's inspired by ancient myths rooted in Africa's pre-colonial heritage. So could you tell me how you use that past as the raw material to craft and imagine the future?
So I think I need to give context about myself and my work. So I'm a visual artist and a researcher and the founder of TOGUNA WORLD, which is an art and foresight research laboratory. And the goal of the platform is very much to use art, spirituality, as a way to facilitate transcultural conversation on desirable future. In the context of this work, essentially, I looked at Ifa, which is a spiritual tradition from West Africa, essentially from the Yoruba. So Yoruba, it's Nigeria, Togo, Benin, but it's as well the tradition that you find across the African diaspora from Brazil. When you look at Candomblé, when you go to Santeria in Cuba, Voodoo in Haiti, the kind of cosmology behind all of this tradition comes from Ifa. And Ifa is at the same time a philosophy, it is a science and a spiritual tradition. And the role of Ifa is essentially to study how energy is transmuted into matter. And in the Ifa context, there is this understanding that everything that exists in our world, humans included, essentially all stem from the same primordial energy. And what I do through TOGUNA, essentially, I'm interested in how can we foster ambitious, bold, positive visions of the future with the understanding that the present in which we live today is essentially informed by imagination. Right? Everything that exists around us stems from our imagination. And very often when we think about future, I think in the context of like something like where we are today with the Dubai Future Forum, we have this foresight methodology that makes a kind of difference between possible future and utopia. And the argument of my work is very much to say that there's no such thing as utopia, because what we see as very normal today, even in terms of technology, the device we're using and so forth, a few centuries ago, this was looked as impossible. So there's no limits into what human can create. The only limits are the limits of our imagination. And essentially what I do with IFA is to facilitate a space where participants can imagine beyond self-limiting beliefs. And so we can start envisioning visions of the future that are rooted in our core desires. So that's why I call it dreams. So our core innermost desires. And these become the foundation for the entire ritual exercise.
I want to talk about that compatibility between spirituality and foresight and dream theory and foresight, because those things feel incompatible, but you're finding a way to bring them together. So what is that methodology?
Essentially, so we go back to IFA. So in the IFA tradition, there is this idea that for humans, so I mentioned before this transmutation between energy and matter. And in IFA, there is this understanding that humans are co-creator of our reality, of our world. And we create the world in collaboration with nature, right? And the way that we create is informed by imagination. But for humans, we have to be conscious of 5 pillars. And I translated in English, these pillars looks at the body, the mind, the spirit, the heart, and the soul. And these are the 5 pillars for which humans create reality, for which humans contribute to the process of creation. And so through the exercise, there is an onboarding part that is very much an art experience, right? So when people can go online right now on TOGUNAWORLD.com, and they will see the Sanctuary of Dream, which is designed as a digital temple. And within that temple, there is a series of videos, and there's one in particular called the Dream Manifesto. And it's very much served to center the philosophy of the entire exercise. And, what I was mentioning, this idea of imagination and reality. And through the exercise, once people are fully onboarded, and essentially the onboarding is to help them really all come to the same foundation as the way that we look at reality. Essentially, the idea is that the way we look at reality informs the way we project ourselves in the world. And it's very much to center imagination as the foundation of our material construct, even in terms of legal, cultural system, etc., all stem from imagination. Through the ritual, we look at 5 questions. How will we eat, play, dream, love, and pray in the context of an ideal future? So it looks at food production, food distribution. Play looks at the economy, but very much without money as with very questioning, because money essentially is a social construct. So it's about what is behind the economy. And to me, what is behind the economy is human collaboration. Money is an incentive that is used to move people towards a shared vision, a shared goal, right? But there are many other currencies that exist and that have enabled humans to collaborate across time. So it's very much about how do we collaborate with one another, and how do we work towards collective vision, shared vision, and very much centering play. So basically joy in that process. Then there is another one that looks at how will we dream, and dream looks at education, but education from 2 aspects. One aspect is how do we share and facilitate the sharing of knowledge, and how do we nurture, strengthen, and empower inner knowledge, inner wisdom, the intuition, the inner voice, right? So how do we, on both hands, facilitate the sharing of external knowledge, but at the same time as well support the development of inner world. And then there's also one that looks at how will we love. And so love looks at community, it looks at family, it looks at extended community, the village, and then civic society as a whole. And it very much looks at what does mutual support, interpersonal relationship, interdependency look like. And then the final one looks at how will we pray, but not from the place of religion, but very much from the place of spirituality. So looking at wellness, mental wellness, physical wellness, and what kind of ritual system can we put in place, individual or collective, in order to help us functions operate at our ultimate best, essentially. So these are the 5 questions that we look. And for each question, essentially what I ask the participant is, how would you like to feel? Essentially. So the aspect of dream is very much centered on participants' innermost desires. And in each scenario, they're very much imagining the core positive feelings, right? So when they're imagining it, they're actually feeling it. And that becomes the foundation for the collective exercise.
To lead with the feeling rather than the thought is an interesting way to alchemize the future, to manifest the future almost. You mentioned there how utopia doesn't feel like it's possible, and yet ideal futures might be possible. What is the difference between those 2 things, and how do you go through the process of creating those idealized rather than utopian style futures?
I think what I do very much is to center people's desires. I have an image, which is, I believe, the way that most people go through life. So imagine you live in a small village, and that evening you decide to go to a restaurant, and there's 3 options. The first one, let's say it's Spanish cuisine. The second one is French, and the third one is, let's say, Nigerian cuisine, right? And you say, okay, we're gonna go for the Nigerian restaurants. So that decision of the options of restaurant in your village, no one consulted you in making. You just found them, okay, what is available? And then once you enter the restaurant, a waiter will come to you and will present you with a menu. And in that menu, you'll see a list of dish. And the next thing you'll do is you'll choose based on what is available in that restaurant. But again, you were not consulted in that decision making. The owner of the restaurant and the chef made that decision based on their own personal interests and agenda. And the truth of it is that this is how most people go through life. Most people go through life by making decisions based on options they believe are available to them. And the way we consider what is available to us is based on the story we have of the world and the story we have of ourselves and our ability, our agency in that construct, right? And even within one family, within one society, each of us have a very different stories of the world. But if you consider the fact that everything that we see around us, ultimately, when you think, what is an idea? An idea, before it is materialized, it's invisible thoughts with someone's mind. It's like something that is not, it's immaterial. And the truth of it is that everything that exists in our world, this is the inception of it. It all started as something that was invisible. And ultimately, the way we should look at reality, we should look at it as the sum of dreams and ideas accumulated across time and places. That's it. That's all it is. And so when you want to think about, and that dichotomy of utopia always tend to say that this is possible and this is not possible, right? As if they are kind of immanent truth that determine reality. And as humans, the best we can do is to find compromise within our life in trying to balance ourselves with it. And to me, what I looked at it for what it truly is. It's an idea. It's a proposition. And the same way that we have created money, when you go back in the history of money, there were multiple currencies that existed at the same time. They are now pushed for new type of currency, digital. All of these things have often sometimes a political history with the way that money was imposed by power, by force, by, authorities, by kings and so forth. The history, the way that gold became the main exchange currency at some point. All of these things, the Bretton Woods, all of these things are politics, are political things, and they're just arbitrary ideas that eventually are so rooted and embedded within the fabric of our lives that we no longer question them and we believe them to be as real as nature, and they are not. And so what I do very much with that exercise is to bring back people to look at reality for what it truly is and to really start imagining future from a place of possibilities. And I believe what should be our core foundation in imagining future should be our desire, our well-being.
So essentially, it's a method to question the fundamental operating system of reality. You mentioned there money. We just take it as granted that that is the way in which the world functions. Listening to you speak, I'm thinking of individuals who engage, and many individuals are in this room and in this conference, engage in this thing called scenario planning. It's about putting bets on definite ways that the future is going to emerge. But what you're suggesting is that we can almost virtualize the future, not virtual in terms of virtual reality, but virtual in terms of use our imagination to suggest a multitude of possibilities that then we can reach out to and bring into the actual, to actualize them or to alchemize them in the way in which you're talking. Now, if everybody engages in that sort of practice, what you end up with is a diversity of future visions. And of course, not all of those futures can come to pass. So how do you contend with that diversity of futures? How do we live in a world that has a multitude of futures available to us, all born of our imaginative processes?
So what I came to realize is that people ultimately want the same things.
Right.
Across diversity, across culture, class, ethnicity, religion. Because right now I just completed a 5 series of investigation with a network called Africans Rising, which is the largest grassroots network across Africa, 44,000 members. And we are working together across a series of activations. We did completed the first one. And you had people from all over the continent, different, obviously, gender, age, employments, backgrounds, lawyer, student, researcher, scientist, like across spectrum. And what you find out is that when you engage through that exercise is that because it's about how do you want to feel, that is the fundamental question. Often if you go with scenarios, people start by what they believe is possible, what they've been conditioned to believe that is possible, right? And so you start from a place of limitation, I would say scarcity. And here it's about first determine what is it you want to feel. So in terms of your ideal value scenario, it's value-based. It's very much about for people to be able to center the agency and the core feeling in that exercise. How would you like to feel? So if you could design your ideal reality, what would it look, what would it feel like? And then based on that feeling, this is now how they try to design scenarios that could potentially sustain that vision. And when we go through the ritual, I have them first thinking for themselves. So it's not something that it's just about you. It's not about thinking of something that can be plausible for society, and I'm going to have to bring everybody to agree with me. No, for yourself, in terms of your core feelings and desire and values, what will it look like? And so they first spend some time individually to imagine, and then they share it as a group. And what you find out is that people want the core fundamental things. And what becomes then interesting through the exercise is that you'll have specific, characters, experiences, stories, etc. And this is based on the stories. Then now you start finding very interesting scenarios. And the things that come through the exercise, initially they look very ambitious, right? And even when you see people sometimes sharing the vision, they're like, okay, people might think I'm crazy, this might seem too much, etc. But then you realize that actually all of these things are very plausible. And it's very much around this idea that, when people say, I love peace, but everybody wants war. So therefore I have to be wise and I have to be rational and I need to prepare for war. And, this kind of like, I want peace, but everybody else wants war. It's like you have this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy where you auto-censor and then you do not allow your voice to emerge at the surface to be able to actualize it. And when they go through that exercise, and often this ability to be able to even question, to even consider what we want is not something that most of us do. When you think about in our society, very often the most successful people in this current social construct, you can look at capitalism. It's just an idea. It's like a video game. It's like Monopoly. We determine this is the parameters for which we're going to interact with one another, and this is what we're going to determine as the economy and all of that, right? All of that is a proposition. And it's political and there's reason behind it. But often the one that win are managers. So it means the people that perform, that understand the rules and that are able to kind of in many ways shut down or silence a true core of who they are and very much find meanings and validation within that external project, right? And so the way that people win in this society is by knowing how to numb your inner voice and by questioning what feels the most natural to you. And if you go, now I'm an adult, I'm mature. This was the moment of my youth and my illusions and etc. And what I do with the exercise is to create a space where people can actually feel safe in listening to themselves. So it's not me presenting my own vision. It's asking them, but how would it look like? And what you find out is that people very much want very similar things, but at the same time, they're very nuanced. And what becomes powerful is first when you get to hear. So when they get to hear the vision shared by the different, it's a validation about the truth that was in them, but that they were not allowing themselves to explore. And then you find beauty in the nuances that everybody brings, because the fundamental core is the same, but then you have nuances around food production, around different type of economy, around different type of distribution and so forth. This is when people are telling stories and they say, I remember when I was a kid or I had this experience and this happened to me. And this becomes a very empowering exercise, but at the same time, a very practical, the outcome of it comes out being very practical. And so the work that we're doing, I mentioned the engagement that we just completed, we're going to finalize a report at the end of January, and we're going to disseminate it over the next year. So I'm going to disseminate it through art installation. We're going to be producing a book. There's going to be a series of the art installation are going to be global. The first one is going to be in May of next year with the Onassis Foundation in Greece. And there's going to be a series across the world. And very much the goal of this exercise will be to share what came through this investigation, and very much invite the general public to question reality, and very much as well to create space where they can hear and listen to the core desire. And this would be the space from which they will interact with the world.
You mentioned something very important there. The idea of self-fulfilling prophecy, because that's kind of at the core of what you're talking about. Self-fulfilling prophecy can otherwise be understood as be careful what you wish for, because it might just come true. And hearing you speak, it feels like what your work does is it allows people to hone their wishes and be aware that what they desire could come to pass, and therefore find methods in which to engage with dreaming as this creative, imaginative process of co-creation, I guess, with reality.
Very much so. Very much so. So it's about creating space where people can listen to the inner voice and discover the core story, right? Which in many ways have been often numbed by society for multiple reasons, and having that as the foundation from which we get to think about our world and our society. When you think about the time in which we are right now, there is an acceleration of the future, in many ways driven by technology. You think about AI, you think about gene modification, you think about all of these things that potentially will come to totally transform the way we understand even what it means to be human. We were discussing earlier about this humanoid, this robot, android robot and so forth. And in many ways, these conversations are decided without us in conversation in the room. These are agendas that are informed by Silicon Valley, by global finance, with a very narrow vision of what it means to be humans, what it means to exist within nature, and the purpose of life, right? And so they have a very limited view of the world, with clear ideologies, which often are not clear philosophies, which sometimes are very keen to religion or doctrine, which often are not made explicit. And these things are just presented to the public as unavoidable. And the best way you can do is to adapt, or you face the risk of becoming obsolete.
Yeah.
Obviously, they know very well that the only way these visions are wishes, and the only way these visions could come to pass if we accept them. And often, the way we accept something is, whether you want it or not, there's a moment when you believe that story, whatever it is, whether positive or negative, to be truer or more real or more potent than your own dream, right? The same way with money, let's say, right? We all have money is not real. Money is a social construct, but money has a real impact in our lives. When we lack money, when we have money, often people have an emotional relationship with money, kind of like a quasi-spiritual identity. Money is a egregore, let's say in a spiritual context, right? It has its own living form. But that power, we give it to it. It's not something that it has intrinsically. And in many ways, the reason why there's such a competition right now to be able to capture people's imagination and dreams is because the people that say they have specific agenda very much understand that this agenda would only come to pass if people embrace them, whether willingly or unwillingly, right? But there is a moment when we have to accept that this is reality and that we're going to have to organize ourselves around it, whether for or against it, but this is reality. And I think what I propose through the exercise is to not be in a place of reaction, but understand the fact that this is just an idea, this is just a proposition. And instead of being from a place of reaction and fear and anxiety, invest in a very different way into our desire, our core feelings, and we build space where that can be rooted in our imagination. And what happens from that place, it allows you to be able to identify core ethics, core values that can then serve as an individual as a blueprint in the way that you go about your life into making decisions. And then you can see when something aligns or doesn't align. Then you can see when something serves you fundamentally and when it does not, in a way that is more genuine than just commodities, than just consumerism, than just, a friend of mine, speaker, looks at the modern capitalist society as the society of perpetual orgasm, over nothing. This society where, the self-gratification is presented as the ultimate goal, but from a very individual perspective that is very kind of schizophrenic in many ways, self-destructing, and there's no purpose. Like you exist, you're like you exist in relationship to nothing. And this it allows people to be rooted, to be in communion with, the world at large, and to have like a clear compass through which they get to individually to think about the life and future. And at the same time as well, what I'm interested in is how can we bring about other alternative scenarios of the future. When you think about in literature, in science fiction, in movies, often the projects that are being funded are dystopian narratives with always very clear ideology of future. And then you say, oh, it's interesting. It seems like science fiction informed technology. No, or technological development. All technological development are based on hypotheses. So they're based on stories, right? And there are stories that you choose to invest in, and there are stories that you choose not to invest in, right? And so in many ways, what you have with science fiction, it's a conditioning agenda. When you bring forward to people consciousness certain type of stories, and if you were to ask these people, is it how you like to live? They will tell you no. But you just present it as if there is a zeitgeist, there is a spirit of the world that supersedes everything, and that it has its own, it's very spiritual, but they don't say it as spiritual. This is a very spiritual way of looking at reality, as if there's this thing that just exists above and that just have its own directions. And as humans, we just have to somehow try to don't miss the train and catch the train in its movement if you don't want to be left out. And obviously, this is not true.
Oh, yeah, the Hegelian notion of spirit that travels through time, and we're just passengers on this big journey into the future. Although you said there the statement that we live in a world of accelerating technology and accelerating change. I mean, those sorts of statements anyway, those are ways in which to express our current moment that create those sort of self-fulfilling prophecies. And yet what we do in response to that is not always drive for continued acceleration, but we start to have these sorts of conversations about how do we amplify what is important about being human. And that, I feel, is what art, the work that you do, does so well. It captures not something technological, but something human about our experience of reality.
Yes, very true.
And I want to talk about the context in which you create your work, because you're interested in your work looks at, and some of the collaborations you mentioned there, the African continent. And the African continent it's gone through these moments in time whereby there's been a moment of Afro-pessimism, followed by a moment of Africa rising. And your work really likes to explore what the opportunity, I guess, is for Africa and how it will represent itself within the future. So what are some of those opportunities that the African continent presents?
So going into this moment of Afro-pessimism and the new wave that came about called Africa Rising, is very much true that after the independence period movement, there was in the 60s, 70s a movement of optimism where African governments and leaders very much invested in education, in health, in culture, and so forth. And they were very much able to build very ambitious projects with a clear vision of what the future could look like. And all of that came to be dismantled through the 80s with the structural adjustment policies that were enforced in the 80s, and that very much showed the full impact in the 90s. And so when you had this moment of Afro-pessimism was very much in that moment in the 90s where African government was being destabilized, internal fighting, all of that's very much rooted in neocolonialism. But that was that moment, kind of like destiny of pain in many ways. But if you project in the future, by the end of the century, Africa is going to become the most populated continent in the world. Nigeria in particular, in 1 century from now, will be the most populated country in the world. Before India and China will become third. 40% of the living population will be on the African continent. So it means that the way we understand the dynamic of power in the world today will change drastically. And I think even the estimation is that even by 2060, Africa will become the most populated continent in the world. So it is, so for me in that context, in that what is very important that as we foster a conversation on future, that the African youth living today is invested in that process of imagining, of being able to define what does a successful future looks like, what are the values that they want to see sustain, they want to see amplify, how does that design looks like, how does it feels like, and so that the option doesn't just become, let's just be like America, let's just be like, China, or essentially things that are not necessarily connected to your own fundamental place of being, values, and so forth. So let's ask ourselves, what does success look like? What does an ideal future looks like? With the understanding that the future of tomorrow is going to be informed ultimately by the dreams of today. Right? When you think about a space like Dubai, it was interesting yesterday when we had the tour, is that you went through the museum, I forget the name, but you went through this museum where you had the visualizations of what Dubai looked like in the 50s.
Yeah.
This is a dream in action that is actualized with visions. Some of the stories were referenced that came from outside, but it's very much a project that is being materialized. And so I'm very much cognizant on the fact that the future is going to be informed by the present, and so it is essential to have multiplicities of dreams in the conversation. And I hear when you were saying about, but what happens if you have competing dreams? I believe that we should have many dreams happening at the same time. The moment that people are able to dream and able to very much look inward and being able to identify what they desire, this is when society functions at its best. My father used to say that most people die before they reach the age of 20 years old, and they're only buried after the 60th birthday. Okay. So what it meant is that many people go through life in many ways like zombies, in the sense where they have accepted the idea that reality is something that is determined outside of them. And the best things they can do, like I was saying before, is to try to find meanings or justification somehow into the options made available to me, or that they believe are available to them. And again, I believe that reality is very opposite. And in the context of going back to what we were discussing at the beginning, is very much centered the fact that in the IFA tradition, it's decided that the whole universe, everything that we see in its full diversity, in its inception is just one dot. It's all in the same thing, right? And so if you look at it from that perspective, then you realize that we need to engage with reality from the place of game and playfulness. And we need to create and co-create with reality in a way that is creative, artistic, and playful.
Well, Pierre-Christophe, thank you for showing us how to play the future with our dreams and asking us the question of how do we want to feel in that future. And I just want to say thank you for joining us for the Futures Podcast live from the Dubai Future Forum. If you like what you've heard, then you can find out more by visiting thefuturespodcast.net. Please put your hands together and join me in thanking Pierre-Christophe Gam.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.